Welcome to Question Mark, the podcast, exploring the greatest story ever told with open minds and open hearts.
We light it up, we won't come down, and the sun can't stop us now. Watching it come true, it's taking over you. This is the greatest show, where it's covered in all the colored lights, and the runaways are on in the night. Impossible comes true, it's taking over you. This is the greatest show.
Hello and welcome to Question Mark, a fortnightly podcast about the greatest story ever told, Mark's Gospel. Whether this is the first episode you've listened to or you're a regular listener, you are very welcome. My name's David Payne, and I'll be your host and guide on this, the 26th episode of our journey through this ancient tale, which still seems highly relevant to life in the 21st century. Are you ready to join us on this unique adventure of faith and life? Well, today it's my great pleasure to introduce our special guest, Neal Parker. Neal has been the head of King Edward VI School in Southampton for 2 years, in his third year now, so just during the pandemic. And Steph tells me you're passionate about music and the arts. And I'll let you introduce yourself in a minute. Stephen Smart has recently started performing again after something of an enforced break for a couple of years, and is looking forward to appearing at the Edinburgh Fringe in August. He had this great idea of inviting friends from many different backgrounds to meet up to chat about the life of Jesus as presented in Mark's Gospel. Well, we'll let the guest go first. So Neal, would you like to start by saying who you are and maybe how you know Steph and the I Am Mark journey?
Yeah, delighted to, David. First of all, thank you to Steph. Thank you to yourself for allowing me to be part of this. So, as you rightly said, I'm Neal. I'm the head at the KES, King Edward VI School in Southampton. I know Steph because we worked together. So I arrived at KES almost 3 years ago. I was mentioning offline when we were chatting that in a stroke of bad timing, I arrived as head at this new school, and less than 2 terms later, all of the pandemic arrived. And so almost all of the time that I've been at the school has been battling through, as all schools have, with the pandemic. But we overlapped. Steph was working at the school at the time, and later moved on to the amazing things that he's doing now. And so I live in Southampton. You mentioned before, I have a bit of a music background, so I was a music teacher. That's what I do. Still a little bit of that. And I was a director of music and a teacher of music in various schools before I came to Southampton. So that's the potted history.
Fantastic. It's great to have you here today. Thanks, Neal. I imagine most of our listeners know Stephen Smart, who started this podcast. Stephen, Neal used to be your boss. So I wonder why you decided to ask him to appear today.
I think I wrote to him initially, David, and to say of all the people I know, he's probably one of the more eloquent. And so that was one of the first things that attracted me to the idea of inviting Neal. And a man who obviously is a deep thinker as well. So I thought it'd be interesting. As I said, or I think you said just now, the whole idea of the podcast was to invite people of all kinds of backgrounds and persuasions. It didn't have to be just people of faith or Christians or whatever. It could be anybody. And because I think this story deserves conversation on a wide scale. And so Neal seemed the perfect choice, really, in that sense.
Great. Well, I'm really looking forward to exploring this story of Jesus walking on the water today with both of you. This is a conversation between friends, as you can see. So without further ado, let's get started. And if, as you, dear listener, listen to this podcast or watch it on YouTube, and you'd like to comment on what you hear today, please do join in, share your thoughts about the passage on social media, and especially on the I Am Mark community Facebook page. So here is today's passage from Mark's Gospel, which is going to be read for us by Lucy Warner. Over to you, Lucy.
Mark chapter 6, verses 45 to 51, New International Version. Jesus walks on the water. Immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. After leaving them, he went up on a mountainside to pray. Later that night, the boat was in the middle of the lake, and he was alone on land. He saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. Shortly before dawn, he went out to them, walking on the lake. He was about to pass by them, but when they saw him walking on the lake, they thought he was a ghost. They cried out because they all saw him and were terrified. Immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid." Then he climbed into the boat with them, and the wind died down. They were completely amazed, for they had not understood about the loaves. Their hearts were hardened. When they had crossed over, they landed at Gennesaret and anchored there. As soon as they got out of the boat, people recognized Jesus. They ran throughout that whole region and carried the sick on mats to wherever they heard he was. And wherever he went, into villages, towns, or countryside, they placed the sick in the marketplaces. They begged him to let them touch even the edge of his cloak, and all who touched it were healed.
Well, thank you very much, Lucy. So the context of this story is the disciples have been sent out in twos, and then there's a section about the death of John the Baptist, which we talked about recently. Then last time, on the last podcast, Jesus and the disciples fed for 5,000 people in this case. And here we have the miracle of Jesus walking on the water. And I wonder, first of all, just what your first impression of this incredible passage is. What do you think, Neal?
Well, firstly, I have to say thank you for giving me this passage. It's a remarkable and very famous part of this extraordinary story. I guess I should sort of declare, first of all, a little bit of context. I personally don't come from a Christian background. I think Steph in the introduction alluded to that, and it's something we've spoken about. As an aside, Steph, thanks for the high praise. I feel I've got a bit of a high bar to live up to with apparent eloquence and articulacy on things and deep thinking. But leave that aside. No, I'm really grateful for this passage. It's one of those passages that we all, in this country and from a Christian sort of tradition as a culture know about. But it was really, for me, it was quite refreshing to revisit something that I know just as a story and to read the words on the page, because we all know about sort of Jesus walks on water. It's if you like, it is the cliche miracle. It is the absolute central core miracle, or at least one of those few. And I noticed in this that it's shortly after the loaves as well, which is that other great moment of miracle working. But to read the words, what I found fascinating about it was what a human story it was. There are little nuances in there which I found quite moving as a story, and as a story that reveals something about the people who were involved in this iconic miracle moment. The doubt of the disciples, the need for solitude that Jesus experiences, and I think it's remarkable that Mark, in just a sentence or two, gets so much across about the people who were there and how they felt and what they were going through. So I loved that, because, as I said, I knew the headline, but to read the story underneath was quite a joy.
Yeah. And what about you, Steph? Is that how you looked at it?
Yeah, I think what Neal says about the people and the human element is something that I've kind of I need to focus on more, actually. So I'm really grateful that he's mentioned that, because I think I focused on the other side of it, if you like. And insofar as when I first read this many, many years ago, I guess I looked at it as a miracle, because that's the sort of thing Jesus does. And Jesus comes across here as, not only incredibly powerful, because he walks on water and somehow the wind absolutely stands still when he gets into the boat, but also incredibly compassionate as well. So he's taking care of the disciples. So on that level, and I still believe that to be really important, that aspect of it, I think I'd got the passage sussed. But the more I've looked at it, the more I realize how much I haven't understood about it, and how complicated it possibly is as well. And I suppose I'm kind of desperate to get to an understanding of what some of these really odd bits might mean. Well, for instance, walking on water, what does that imply? Whether we accept it happened or not, let's say, at least from the point of view of the author, it did. What does that imply? What's it pointing to? Those are the big questions for me. And I don't know if I've got an answer. I may have several answers. I'm not sure whether I've got a genuinely, absolutely bona fide answer. No one's going to disagree with, but nevertheless, it's an interesting question.
You disappoint us, Steph. We were expecting all the answers today. So it sounds like a good discussion we have ahead of us. So let's get on. I thought we split it into 4 sections. The first section where Jesus sends the disciples away, as Neal's already said, so he can pray. How does that seem to you, Neal?
Well, as I said, and for me, there's this sense of, for Jesus, the man, but also, Jesus in his role as the Son of God, as a divine sort of figure, that speaks volumes about someone who has these extraordinary responsibilities, these extraordinary pressures. And when you read the Bible, or when you explore the Bible in any way, and I'm talking very, very superficially as someone who has not been immersed in the Bible, what always has, since childhood, since I was told these stories as childhood, I've always had that sense of, well, what would that feel like? He is this sort of chosen figure, but what is it like to be that figure, and to have doubt and unbelievers, and actually in his own day to have extraordinary opposition, extraordinary sort of mocking, lack of belief, and yet to know that this is the path that you need to take, and to know that this is the way you have to go. And what I took from this passage was the sense of a person who, as I understand it at this point in the story, as told by Mark, and it's been rather nice getting to know the broader story and how it fits together through getting ready to speak to you. And there seems to be this period in Mark's gospel, and either of you will correct me if I've got this completely out of kilter, but there seems to be this period at this stage in the gospel where there are these succession of miracles. There is almost this testing, this proving of faith that goes on at this point in particularly in Mark's telling of the gospel. And so there seems to be this challenge that is placed upon Jesus. And at this point, he seems to be, as it were, surrounded by those who don't yet have faith, and having to constantly put forwards and show people that their faith should be placed in him, and would be well placed in him. And that sort of, pressure upon the man, I find extraordinary. So I am very empathetic to the fact that a person like this just occasionally needs to have some time to reflect and to have solitude with his own thoughts and with his God. So that is what I love about this is just a couple of sentences. You can start to get so much out of it. But that's what I take from this open bit. I find it fascinating that he sends his disciples away, but there's a bit of give the guy a break. I'm not surprised at all.
Steph, what do you think?
I think that's really interesting. Again, I think I've underestimated recently the human side of Jesus, and I take Neal's point absolutely. Maybe then that explains something that's been on my mind. Again, a question about what Jesus does in this little bit. He made his disciples get into the boat. So made is it's quite a forceful word, but actually, as I understand it in the Greek, it's more like compel. he compelled them. Maybe Neal's right. Maybe he was so tired and so kind of, the life had really become quite burdensome. He needed the time alone. He didn't want his disciples with him. Maybe that's what's going on. However, maybe too, there's something about Bethsaida which is of interest. This is not my idea, I'll be honest. It's someone else's, but nevertheless, it's something that's interested me. Bethsaida is on the other side of the lake from Jewish territory. It's a mixed Jewish Gentile area. So they're in a place near Capernaum right now where the feeding of the 5,000 takes place. And Jesus is making them get into the boat to go to Bethsaida. Now, if you were a good Jewish boy in those days, what you wouldn't want to do is go over to Gentile territory. That is just not your bag. In fact, you're recognizing yourself as possibly ending up being unclean ritually. So to do that is not a good idea from the disciples' point of view. Now, I mention it because I think that might be quite an important key for what happens in the rest of the passage. And I think the other thing that strikes me about this, again, it's only striking me, I'm not coming up with any answers, I hope, is that he does go up on a mountain. I don't know which mountain it would have been. I've absolutely no idea. It might have been just a hill. But it's, again, fascinating to me that it doesn't, in the original Greek, it doesn't say a mountain like it says in the translation that Lucy read from. It's the mountain. And when you read in the Bible about godly figures going up the mountain, I think you immediately begin to think, oh, okay, there's something significant going to happen here. Because we obviously think of Moses and we think of what happened when he went up the mountain and received the 10 Commandments and had an experience of God. So there's something maybe going on here as well that's intriguing. I'll leave it at that for the moment.
Leave it at that. So in the second section, the disciples have been straining at the oars for several hours. This went on for quite a time. It went on all night. It wasn't until kind of 6 o'clock in the morning, as I understand it, that Jesus decided to come and help them. The hardened sailors, some of them, fishermen. Yeah. And this incredible thing that Jesus walked on the water to them and the wind calmed down. In Matthew's version, Peter says, "You are the Son of God," and he realizes that's who Jesus is. In here, it doesn't say that, but who is Jesus? What do we make of this person? Which I think is a something that's come up in a lot in previous sections, hasn't it? In previous episodes.
Definitely.
Who is this man that this happens? What do you think we make of that?
Shall I pop in first and then?
Yeah, go on.
Yeah. Okay. So, you're right about Mark's Gospel. The more I perform it, the more I read it, the more I realize that the question that happens a bit later on, which is Jesus asking his disciples, "Who do people say I am?" And then he says, "Who do you say I am?" It's kind of like a central question. So I'm really glad you mentioned this idea of, who is Jesus? Well, I'll put it bluntly. The possibility is, as far as I can tell, that this passage suggests Jesus is the equivalent, identified with God himself. And the reason I say that is because of this walking on the lake business. Or it would have been in the original Mark's version, actually, walking on the sea. Walking on the sea is something that God does a lot in the Old Testament. And in fact, it's often associated with the idea of God parting the waves of the Red Sea. So he trod a path for the Israelites. So there's a potential here of Jesus being connected to the Godhead. In other words, God in human form. So if that's the case, that has huge implications. I mean, that's possibly the basis of the Christian faith, I guess. So I suppose Christian scholars over the ages have looked on this passage and thought, this proves, this shows, this is what who Jesus really was, both fully human, as Neal's pointed out earlier, because he obviously is, and at the same time fully divine, which is, I don't know how you feel about it, Neal and David, but for me, I just can't get my head around that. It's impossible. So I'm not absolutely surprised, and I'm, a bit of a spoiler here, but I'm not absolutely surprised that the disciples couldn't get anything of this at the end of it.
And there does seem to be, so I from my understanding, there is quite a lot of scholarly debate about the translations of the various terms, whether that's Christus or Messiah, and in terms of what that might imply. And there's, and again, I'm sure both of you will be able to school me on this. But again, there's quite a debate about the different gospels and the reference to Son of Man or Son of God and the use of that. My feeling, for what it is worth, is exactly as Steph said there. This is a miracle, but it's not a sort of party trick miracle, if you like. It's the symbolism associated with walking on water. I think, from what I know of the traditions that this comes from, makes it very, very apparent that this is placing Jesus within the Son of God, or the representative of God, or the Godhead, and not, as I believe other traditions would have it, a sort of a miracle worker, a sort of magic figure, as it were. And of course, it does feel a little bit like a setup, in so much as he sends them out onto the Sea of Galilee, and from what I understand, that was not something anyone particularly wanted to do at the time. There was a lot of mistrust about trying to cross the Sea of Galilee. It wasn't a friendly body of water at the time. He puts them in that position. Along comes a storm, which even though some of them are experienced sailors, it proves too much. And then he specifically wanders out to them. It does feel like if you doubted me before, surely you can't now. And it's not just about having magical properties, it's about absolute divinity.
About, revealing who he is, not so much saying, oh, look what I can do.
Yeah, as we say in the classroom, show, don't tell.
Yeah, absolutely. I really like that. I don't know if either of you saw that Netflix series called Messiah, which was all about a modern day miracle worker who looks amazingly like Jesus, you'd imagine, Jesus to look anyway. And he does a party trick. So he walks on the water just outside the Capitol building in Washington. And this is arouses huge awe and amazement. But you're absolutely right. I don't think that's what's necessarily at stake here at all. There's much more going on, between and behind this, as you say. For me, also, some of these phrases are kind of really, really important. Like the middle of the lake. It's like the middle. That's the phrase that is used of the Red Sea, parting the middle of the sea. And when he was about to pass by them, that's a phrase again used about God in the Old Testament. I'm not sure why these things occur, but I don't think you can avoid them as echoes of some of this idea of Jesus's identity, potentially.
I'm really sorry, Dave. I was just going to say I'm really pleased you brought up the he was about to pass by them, because when I read this passage, that's the bit I really couldn't understand why that was in there. Because in my head I was sitting there saying, okay, he's sent them out. He's again, my sort of very superficial reading, he's going to show them. He's going to make sure they understand, because, a bit of a spoiler alert, it's obvious that they haven't understood or fully grasped yet what they are confronted by here. But then he was about to pass by them, and you think, if that's literal, then what on earth is going on there? These poor disciples who have been laboring and making no progress at all. Wouldn't you go direct and say, here I am, your troubles are at an end?
Yes.
But maybe that's not quite as literal a section as I was reading it to be.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that there may be some hints going on there beyond the literal, but I know that there are many people who have come up with this problem, the same problem we've come up with. This phrase, he was about to pass by them, and there are all sorts of explanations, like Jesus wanted to go past them because he was in a rush, or things like that. Which we can speculate on. Again, I don't know if the answers are very clear, but as I said earlier, I can't help but think about this phrase. I think it's from the book of Job. It talks about God treading the water and passing by. And there's also in Exodus, it talks about God's appearance before Moses, and it talks about God passing by at that stage. So God doesn't show himself fully to Moses. He only shows him his back. And he says to Moses, you hide in the cleft of the rock while I pass by. So the phrase here is very reminiscent of something really awesome. So although there may not be an obvious literal explanation for what Jesus may be doing here, although there may be, who knows, there's something else perhaps going on as well.
Could be the way the writer was interpreting it.
Yeah.
Just tell us something. So in the next, if we want some encouragement that about this setup that Neal suggested, it does encourage me that immediately, as soon as they called out, immediately he spoke to them and he said, right in the middle of this passage, take courage. These in my Bible, it's red, which is nice. Take courage, it's I, don't be afraid. The only words that are recorded, which is, and then he climbed straight into the boat and the wind died down. And then it does say, and another intriguing bit, they'd not understood about the loaves. Maybe you've got some thoughts about that, but their hearts were hardened. What's that about?
Yeah, so I love this bit. So I will stop taking the sort of humanist, literalist attitude here because this is the heart of it. Because what I love about this passage, it's only a few short lines, but it's two miracles, not one. It is the walking on water, and that's the one which we all know. But when he arrives and he says to them, take courage, and at that point, the storm dies down as well. And I love what this seems to suggest, and it's not something I'm party to, because I'm not fortunate to have that ability to call on a faith. But that idea of essentially, in your worst strife, in your travails, in your when everything is going wrong and all about you is literally, in this case, a tempest. The moment he arrives in the boat and the boat becomes this representation of those people within the boat, when he steps aboard, it becomes calm. And I think that is a very powerful expression of what faith ought to be. And I think it's rather moving and rather lovely in that sense. And it's the fact that he literally steps aboard. We see later on that it's when people touch his cloak, when people make contact, physical contact, that they get relief and they get joy in their lives and they get healing. And here, it's the moment that they let him in, the moment he gets on board the boat, that everything is calmed. And I think that's quite powerful. And then I'll come back separate. I'll let Steph comment on that because I'm interested to hear.
Again, I would echo everything that Neal said. I totally appreciate that, how much comfort those lines can bring. And I honestly, at this point in my life, I'm going through a bit of a struggle, which I won't be precise about on the air, as it were. But I coincidentally read this passage, not just to study it. I read it the other day just devotionally. And it really, really spoke to me, because it gave me the sense that even in the midst of my own difficulty, God was on the case, and I shouldn't lose heart and don't be afraid. I'm not sure that I'm taking that all on board, if I'm honest. Nevertheless, it is a recurring kind of motif in my subconscious, if you like, which I can't escape from. And to me, that feels like it's the voice of God for me personally. And I know that Christians over the ages have taken this particular passage in exactly the same way, as a source of great comfort in times of trial. But having said all of that, this phrase, "it is I," really grabs my attention again. And I don't know if you're aware of this, you may well be, but this phrase, "it is I," could be taken as, don't worry, it's me, it's okay, don't be afraid. And they must, I guess, have felt less afraid seeing him, recognizing him for who he is rather than being a ghost. They would have thought, oh, good, we recognize you. Not only that, we see you, you're Jesus, and Jesus, you've helped us out many times before, and therefore we haven't got so much cause to be afraid anymore because we know it's you. But actually the phrase also means literally in the Greek, and it's taken from, it seems to be the same phrase used in the Greek version of the Old Testament, which is the one that Jesus would have read, the one that Mark would have read, which is not "it is I," but "I am." So it should read, if you like, literally, "take courage, I am. Don't be afraid." And then if you look back to the previous phrase, it talks about he spoke to them, which I've not realized this before, but I'm just thinking it's a dead of night. They can't see anything. They're crying out in terror, and the wind is howling, a strong east wind. It's howling around them, and it says he spoke to them. Well, wouldn't he call to them? Wouldn't he speak a little louder than speaking to them? But he spoke to them again, and it's a phrase from the Old Testament, the Greek version, again identified with God. So when God speaks at the creation of the world in Genesis, that's the phrase that's used. So it's a really, really powerful, meaningful section. It's not saying in so many words, Jesus is the Son of God. It's not saying Jesus is divine, but it's giving a huge red arrow of a hint, I think, potentially. Yeah.
I like that. I was going to say, I like that "I am." That's new on me. So does that mean don't be afraid because I exist, because there is God in this world? Is that again a slightly too easy sort of interpretation of the original Greek?
I don't think it is. I mean, it's hard to get your head around it completely, I'll be honest, because if you take the phrase "it is I" as actually equaling "I am," then you have to explain the first bit, "take courage," and the last bit, "don't be afraid." And whether the three phrases actually work together as neatly as the translation we have in front of us is another matter. Having said that, yes, I'm broadly, I would agree with you that there is that claim going on here, potentially. Jesus is making a claim. And that, for me, possibly explains the bit about the hearts being hardened, because they aren't able to take that bit in. Yeah. It's what we've been talking about already, the idea of this not just being a magic trick, this being a clue, this being a revelation of who Jesus is. They're not able to take that in. It's a huge thing to take in, because they've just seen him, as you said, Neal, earlier. He's a human being who's got human needs. He's although he's done all these miracles, he goes up mountains to get energy back. He needs time alone. He gets hungry, and this is a man who also walks on water, and how do you get your head around that? How can you say on the one hand he's obviously a human being, on the other hand he's obviously God? It's really hard. So I'm not surprised their hearts were hardened. I think we find it hard too.
Yeah, and they I mean, I must admit, when I first read this, I was quite amused by the fact that they thought it was a ghost. And I don't know whether that's lost something in translation, but when you look at it within the context of the sweep of the Gospel of Mark, you know, as I understand it chronologically, if Mark can be relied on for chronology, and I know that there's a lot of scholarly debate about how well the chronology of the Gospels works. But again, my understanding is that Mark is seen as the most reliable in terms of being able to establish chronology and so on. We've had the loaves, and it's alluded to here. So I don't know how proximate the two things are, but they are certainly one and then the other. Jesus has just done this extraordinary thing with the loaves and the fishes, and their go-to when they see a being coming to them on water in the midst of a storm is it's a ghost. Their hearts are definitely hardened by my book, because surely if you've just seen that, your go-to is, well, maybe what I saw with the loaves and the fishes actually was the real deal. And yet still they think, well, it's a ghost. And they go for the slightly less deep, less difficult answer, maybe.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. But I guess again, we can feel a certain amount of sympathy for them, because if we think it's a ghost, I would imagine that would be a reasonable explanation if we believed in ghosts, of someone walking on the water. And we don't normally experience that in everyday life. So you can understand how they got to that place. But yeah, no, I totally agree with you. I think it's like they're missing a trick.
In great contrast, perhaps, when they've landed at Gennesaret, which I don't think was where they were aiming for, was it?
No, on the other side.
Everyone recognized Jesus. Presumably the wind had blown them off track.
Yeah.
Jesus went to marketplaces, and everyone who touched the hem of his robe was healed. We just accept that he healed everyone. I mean, here's another miracle. Everyone was healed.
Yeah.
Jesus was very well received here, wasn't he? Everybody turned up and just believed it would happen. In stark contrast, perhaps, to what we've just seen with the disciples thinking.
Yes.
And isn't that fascinating? I mean, that is fascinating to me. And again, that, you know, when I read it, and I mentioned to you earlier, it almost feels like a setup. It almost feels like a proof to the disciples. And you know, you think of the disciples as being the most full of faith. They're the ones who are literally alongside him on his journey, who see him on a daily basis. And there is maybe a message in there that his disciples need to stop overthinking things to a degree, because those people who he meets, who are more immediately accepting, you know, as it were, just the general people, the people who come out to the villages, the people who come out to the towns, who are desperate for help and for healing. They don't overthink it. They don't see a ghost. They see someone who can work these miracles, someone who can help them, and they just touch his cloak and they just come into contact with him. And again, if you take the whole thing sort of as a metaphor rather than as a literal thing, that idea of just have faith, just make the contact, don't overthink it, don't constantly go, well, maybe it could be that, maybe it could be the other, maybe. And there's a little bit of, I pictured, and I'm entirely not qualified to do so, but I kind of pictured Jesus kind of going to his disciples when they get there to is it Gennesaret? Gennesaret?
Yeah.
Gennesaret. Let's call it Gennesaret. When he gets there, I kind of picture him sort of going, you see these guys? You know, they believe.
Yeah.
They're not questioning. They're not, you know, they're believing. And look what happens. And again, you know, that's probably ascribing far too human and far too 21st century sort of motivations. But there is a little bit of the disciples ought to be those who have the greatest faith. And yet he seems to need to reiterate and re-emphasize what they need to believe. Whereas those people who just want someone to help, they just go to him and he does what he does.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I love that. I really do. I think the level of faith here is interesting too. It's not based on theology about this or that. It's about instinctive, intuitive, discerning, understanding, a recognition of need as well. And it's true that there is faith here. It's not just, again, a magic trick. It's not like, Jesus is kind of passing by. If I just touch his cloak, I guess, because he's got power, it'll come to me. It's more like they had faith to touch. And it's rather like the woman, I think in chapter 5, has the same thing. She has the faith to touch Jesus's cloak. That's the point. So I think what you've just said is absolutely marvelous. I think the word healed is quite interesting. I haven't worked out why it's important, but I think it is. They were all healed, but also this phrase healed is actually, again, it's not just healed, it means saved as well. And it's the same word that Jairus's daughter is said to be healed or saved or rescued. So there's something going on here perhaps about, again, what Mark's weaving into this is something about what Jesus is about. Who is he? Why is he around? What's he doing? It's not just to save or heal these particular individuals. Maybe there's something more that he has in mind. Maybe that's why Jesus is so important for the world. So there you go.
And I like that contrast, because we were talking earlier about the fact that he came into the boat, and the point at which he came into the boat and they kind of accepted, if you want to think of it in that sense, him into this vessel, then they were saved, literally. Yeah. And again, when they reach out, again, if you think of healed in the sense that you explained, Steph, and to be saved, to be spiritually saved as well as physically repaired, as it were, they come to him and they reach out, and then that contact allows them to have that. I do think it speaks about faith and about, letting faith and letting Jesus and God come into your life. And I think there is a less literal and a deeper story running through this.
Yeah, wonderful.
So I wonder, in closing, whether there's one thing that either of you would take away from this, one thought that maybe it's what we just finished with, I don't know, one thing that you'd take away and think about.
I think I'd like to say, if anything was listened to from this podcast, I think it was the comment that Neal made before the last one about this idea of faith and not overthinking, but recognizing that that's all that's needed, actually. And no, I thought it was that was just such a brilliant, helpful comment, and it really, really struck me. Thank you, Neal.
Yeah, I mean, that for me, that's the central idea in this story. As I said, I love this passage because it's not about icons, it's about people. And I think there's a lot of humanity in there. But by contrast, there's a lot of faith in this passage. So those two things, I think, make it a rather wonderful passage.
Neal and Stefan, it's been a real pleasure, and hopefully we'll have started many more conversations among our listeners. Thank you so much for joining us today, Neal Parker and Stefan Smart. And if you would like to share your thoughts about what's been discussed, please do share them on the I Am Mark community on Facebook. And you can also find a prompt there to submit questions for future episodes. Please join us again or listen to previous episodes on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Music platforms. The more of you who like and subscribe, the more people will get to hear about us. However, the go-to place is the I Am Mark page on Facebook. This is where you can find links to watch previous episodes of Question Mark, find out about upcoming performances, and book Steph even to come and do a performance for you. You can also support his ministry and help him get to Edinburgh this summer. If you'd like to get involved and submit questions for future episodes, it's easy to become a fully signed up member of the I Am Mark community Facebook group. If you're not already part of this group, just find us on Facebook and join in the conversation. Well, that's all we have time for now. So it's goodbye from Neal Parker.
Goodbye.
Goodbye from Stefan Smart.
Bye-bye.
And until next time, goodbye from me. Goodbye.
If you enjoyed this episode of Question Mark and don't want to miss any future episodes, be sure to click on the subscribe button. This also means other people can find the podcast and join the conversation too. We'd also love if you could leave a review so we know what was good and what we can improve for future episodes. If you want to find out more about I Am Mark, Stefan Smart's solo word-for-word dramatisation of Mark's Gospel, go to www.sleek neal.bio/IamMark, where you can sign up for free for his newsletter and a whole host of other goodies. Join us and our special guests next time, where we'll continue to explore the greatest story ever told together. If you want to get involved with the podcast or have any questions or comments in the meantime, please do get in touch using the I Am Mark social media channels. We'd love to hear from you.
We light it up, we won't come down, and the sun can't stop us now. Watching it come true, it's taking over you. This is the greatest show, where it's covered in all the colored lights, and the runaways are on in the night. Impossible comes true, it's taking over you. This is the greatest show.
If you enjoyed this episode of Question Mark and don't want to miss any future episodes, be sure to click on the subscribe button. This also means other people can find the podcast and join the conversation too. We'd also love if you could leave a review so we know what was good and what we can improve for future episodes.